science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation on contemporary architecture and contemporary architectural thinking, and today I am talking to the well-known historian Louis Cohen. And if you have been following his work, you will know that Jean-Louis is a person who is not only prolific in his output, but is someone who has studied architecture at diverse scales and in diverse locations, including that of France, Germany, North Africa, the United States, Eastern Europe, and other related areas. With an opportunity to talk to Jean, I have taken this time to discuss the history and trajectory of modernism, of modernity, as he sees it from a high altitude, with the idea of trying to develop a sharper, clearer picture of the import of modernity and modernism, what it was, and in particular, what is it standing today, and what is it that we can learn about it in terms of our ability to understand the present and prepare for the future, in particular here in the 21st century. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope to do a lot more on this topic in the future. Here we go. Jean-Louis, thank you for having this conversation with me, and welcome to Architecture Talk. It's a pleasure to have you here and to explore what historiography may be all about. And you know, as I was trying to get ready for our conversation today, of course, I have your books sitting behind me over here, and I did try to see some of your recent talks online. And as usual, as everyone knows, you know, you are so unbelievably prolific. You produce, it seems to me, a book and a monograph every other year, and meanwhile you have exhibitions, and meanwhile you have all these PhD students. And then on top of that, you were just telling me you're in south of France, but you are teaching in Paris, but I know you have a fabulous apartment in NYU in Manhattan, and your work also, you say, in many ways deals with the kind of a transnational kind of a question. You know, there's always, there's the French Algeria question, there is the German French tension, and so on. So you yourself are kind of multi-placed, and your work is interested in multi-placement, if I may say so this way, right? Why is that?
Thank you, Vikram, for having me in the program. I'm very happy to be able to continue in a focused way an exchange which has taken place in several places over the years.
Yeah.
So since you're asking me about what seems to be perhaps not an obsession, but at least a concern for transnationalism and often binationalism, there are probably a series of reasons to this attitude of mine. The first one might be a biographic one. I would define myself as a Parisian Jew on one hand, but also as a wandering Jew. So there are these two aspects. I'm deeply
a Parisian and a wandering Jew.
Yes. I'm deeply rooted in Paris. All my grandparents were born here from various sources. So for me, Paris is very.
But you have some connection to Casablanca, no? I mean, your uncle wrote a book. Yeah, sorry.
The connection to Morocco is a scholarly one. Yeah. I had Moroccan ancestors, but they left Tétouan, which was sort of transposition of Granada on African soil. They left Tétouan in the late 18th century. So that's
late 18th century, or like 1790s or something like that.
Yeah,
I see.
more than 200 years ago. So no clear legible connection to Morocco, but an interest in perhaps also, and this is where this transnational question becomes interesting. On my part, I think it's a reaction against the tired opposition, which has been very often used in the writing of the history of architecture and of other disciplines between international and national. The idea of a sort of international umbrella in architecture, the international congresses, and then the national situations. And I'm more interested in what I would call the bilateral, the connections between national scenes, north-south. This is France, Morocco, and Algeria. France south, but also south-north, as the colonial experience had an impact on the central state. So south, north, north, south, but also east, west, west, east. Between, of course, France and Germany, France and Italy, between the US and Russia. This is my last big book on the Russian-American connection, which has been an extremely important one in the 20th century.
But why? What's the problem with the international national discourse from your point of view?
This kind of discourse doesn't take into account how architecture and culture operate. Architecture and culture operate in a porous manner through the construction of ideals. Architects, but also intellectuals at large, construct ideal scenes to which they relate. And these ideal scenes can be very close. I mean, French intellectuals reading Nietzsche before 1914, it was very close, but it can be also very far away. Leo Trotsky reading Henry George, and who had an impact on Frank Lloyd Wright in the US, which then bounced back into Russia in the 1930s. So I'm interested in sort of worldwide circulation of ideas, of patterns, of themes, of discourse, if you want.
So that's the wandering Jew in you, right? I mean, that's.
And the wandering part is that it's, I like to, I'm still what I would say attached to paper, to archives, to books, to journals, to correspondence, which is still largely on paper. And I like to get it where it is in remote archives. And also I feel, and this is the architect in me, perhaps a difference in respect with historians who are only working on paper. I feel I can only understand a situation if I know the place, if I have a feeling of the place, of the setting, of the atmosphere, of the scale of places. Otherwise, I think one misses very much if one remains on a completely book-based type of knowledge.
So you're saying this kind of multinationality, transnationality, cross-nationality is an important thing because it is actually a more accurate descriptor of how things go on in the world. Is that basically it? And
yes, I think it's a more it sticks very much to the way people operate. And even at another level, I would insist, and this was the core of a lecture course I gave this year at the Collège de France about what I've called transurban, interurbanity, or transurban history. Very often things are crystallized in cities and in relationships between cities. London wanting to become Paris at some point, Paris wanting to become Rome, Rome wanting to be Rome wanting to become Berlin. So I think we have seen many of these phenomena, and they are still existing to this day. So I've tried to map, in the case of cities, I've tried to map the connections between how this transfer from city to city operate. They operate through representations, but also through factual, through empirical techniques, the transfer of particular forms of urban design, the deformation, the reading and the deformation of particular types of fabric. So I think there are concrete procedures, and the recomposition of all these fragments into a different whole. So I'm really interested in in the practical procedures of these displacements of urban form.
Right, right. Yeah, in fact, I remember in 1986, on my very first flight ever on the way to the United States, was from Bombay to London. And I was doing a stopover there. And we were going to do the Eurail tour of Europe, but first stop was London. And I got into London and I was walking around and I said, man, this looks like Bombay. And it may sound strange, I don't know, to you, but so much of the language of the train stations, the signage of the subway, the sense of order and organization. Of course, we know there's a colonial prehistory that connects this thing, but there is this interaction, as you're talking about, interurbanity, intra-urbanity, whatever is the term, this sort of things that go on. So what is your thesis there? Why is this the case? Is it the case of desire? Is it the case of politics and power?
Well, there are different aspects. I would put them look at them from the point of view of time. If you look at at American cities and the way they have North American cities, and the borrowings they've made of forms from Paris or Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, they were doing that because they were seeing their future. They were looking at these cities as their necessary destiny. With the development of the United States, they were thinking they would become like the old world, and they had to subscribe to the language of the old world. At the same time, European cities were beginning to see in Chicago or New York an image of their own future. So this is one attitude, looking at other cities as expressions of future. And this is the core principle of Americanism, as I've defined it years ago together with Hubert Damisch and then on my own. So looking at the future, but it's also, of course, looking at a glorious past. I mean, if you take the case of Rome, Rome starts by rebuilding itself after its own image at the Renaissance. And then you have other Romes. You will have a third Rome locally with Mussolini, Rome trying to emulate its glorious past. So not looking at Rome as an image of the future, but looking at Rome as an image of the past. If you look at Petersburg, when Petersburg was created by Peter the Great, the models were models of ancient or not so ancient, but anyway of previous European cities. So I think this identification with other cities operates on the scale of time, either towards the future, towards a desirable future, or towards a legitimate past.
Right, right. And in many ways, the past as the future reimagined in many different ways. So I wonder if one can sort of parse this down a little bit more, and if I can put two examples which are close to me, which I know you are very familiar with. Also, I'm trying to set up a contrast, if there is a contrast, between such a process in place in the making of Chandigarh, let's say, as a post-colonial city, which is certainly, looking at other places. There's all kind of referentiality there. There's all kind of transfer and movements of people, and we can talk a little bit about how that functions in terms of this discourse that you are describing of movement of ideas. And I want to try and compare that to I don't know, whatever you want to call it, global architecture today, Dubaification of the world, which certainly is an important thing going on in India and many other parts of the world. So without any prejudgment, let's take those two moments one at a time. You did, you sometime back, you had your zigzag discussion about Corbusier's politics and architecture, and you sort of conclude that discussion. I'm sure you've published more on it, but around 1950, 45, 50. We can get into politics later, but I just want to talk about this interurbanity. So how does a place like Chandigarh in your conception, figure in this kind of trajectory of interreferencing?
Le Corbusier injected in his views on Chandigarh a series of observations he had made in India. The observatories, the gardens at Pinjora, the articulation of Punjabi villages. So there was, as always, a component of local observation.
Sure.
But there is for me a very interesting sketch, not done by him. I don't think it's his hand, it's someone in the office with whom could be traced. But there's an interesting drawing in which he compares the plan of Chandigarh with the plan of Lutyens for New Delhi. And there's a third term, which is the axis from the Louvre to the Étoile in Paris, the main axis of Paris.
Yeah.
So in a way, there is the idea that a capital city is something particular. And I think Le Corbusier, who never really worked on a capital city ab initio, from the beginning, on a white sheet, tries to understand the scale of Chandigarh as the scale of a big capital. So there is this aspect. And the other one is, of course, is well known. It's the recycling of the garden city based
Albert Meyer's
plan of Albert Meyer, which is different. So in a way, Chandigarh merges two systems: the system of the capital, the collage of neighborhoods of post-war urbanism, which Le Corbusier readjusts and reads and readjusts in his own way, and then the grid, the circulation grid of the famous seven roads, which he had been working on since the war. So it's a sort of, as always in the work of Le Corbusier and of many other architects, it is a sort of vertical collapse of a series of layers which have different types of determinations.
Yeah, a kind of a palimpsest, if you like.
So it's a layering. It's a layering because the palimpsest is based on the ground. Palimpsest needs a ground. It's more layering. It's more, if you want, compare. I would use a term from pastry. It's more a Napoleon or a millefeuille, a kind of pastry in which you have layers and layers of puff pastry. And with layers, with intermediate layers of cream. So it's more system. Where is the cream? Where is the pastry?
Where is the pastry? Where is the cream?
I leave open. And then there is icing on top of the cake, which I mean the parallel could work.
Yeah, we could spend a lot of time figuring out which is which. So I guess the question is, so would you argue that this process, this layering of the pastry, that is Chandigarh, in Corbusier's sort of reconceptualization of it, is this part of the general trajectory of intercity referencing, or is this a particular moment?
You're talking about the Chandigarh episode?
Yes. I'm saying the Chandigarh episode as Corbusier, as the process that you described it. Is this a particular technique to Corbusier, or is this, as you are arguing, this is how cities work? This is how it is done?
I don't think Le Corbusier is any different from other city makers. I'll take one example on which I have worked. Well, let's take the example of a famous one, which is Haussmann's Paris. Paris of Haussmann, which is not composed by Haussmann, but rather by Napoleon III, by the emperor, who had a really good knowledge and interest in city matters, can be seen as combining the idea of large thoroughfares, large roads open in existing fabric, as it had been done in Rome at the Renaissance. So there is a Roman component, and there is also, and this is really important on the part of the emperor, an interest for London, and the grid of public gardens is clearly inspired by London, where the emperor had been in exile before 1848. So you meet Paris, the Paris model, of course, and there is also self-referentiality to previous moments in the history of Paris. but you could say that it's generated by both Rome and London. And then, of course, the Parisian model can be exported and transformed in many ways. If now and there are really interesting processes by which models can be inverted. I'll take another European model of the 19th century, which is a fascinating one. When in 1862, the big expansion plan for Berlin is made by James Hobrecht, who is also a bureaucrat like Haussmann. The model is Haussmann, but it's a sort of inverted Haussmannian pattern, a system of streets and squares which was used inside the existing city for Paris becomes a system ensuring the regular growth of Berlin. Mm-hmm. It becomes an expansion system with the same devices. So I think that I don't think that that there are cities that are pure invention. Perhaps in the mind of writers like Italo Calvino, of course, but even in the case of Italo Calvino,
oh yeah, they're layered. Calvino's cities are layered. Yeah.
Yes, but there's a very interesting passage in Calvino's Invisible City. When the Khan with whom Marco Polo talks in the book tells him, but there is a city you never mention, and this city is Venice. And Marco Polo says, absolutely not. Venice is everywhere in my stories. Everywhere when I'm talking of every single city, I'm talking about Venice.
Oh.
So
what does that mean? Because that's an interesting thing, because when I think of the South Asian, Southeast Asian kind of template, every city is Ayodhya. Ayodhya is this kind of template city, which...
No, it means that every city has tells him something about Venice, about the articulation about the morphology of Venice, about the morphology of the relationship between land and water, the relationship between square and street, the relationship between monument and fabric, so that every city, in a way, is adding something to a portrait of Venice.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you sort of parse this conversation, this sort of theory, into the modernist claims of tabula rasa? I mean, not tabula rasa. I think tabula rasa is a bad word, but just certainly a kind of, at least some kind of a determined break with the kind of organic development of history, right?
I don't think one should blame one should put all the blame on the architects in terms of this idea of the tabula rasa. The project of a tabula rasa is the project of capitalism. And
what do you mean?
You read Karl Marx's manifesto of 1848, where he says that all the sacred values of the past have been trampled upon by capitalism. Mm-hmm. The capitalist modernization of city wants to get rid of the old features of historic cities, to make money, to make a new type of developments. The Social Democrats subscribe to this program in the name of hygiene and in the name of creation of healthy workers' housing. So there is a general thrust of society. I'm just saying here that the architects, the modern architects and planners, were just more a radical wing of a comprehensive movement which was rooted in society. No one, and except some really very, very, what I would say, isolated prophets, was fighting to keep the fabric of old cities in the 1920s in Europe. No one. People were fighting to preserve a church or to preserve a piece of maybe an old mansion, but there was no one who was supporting the idea of keeping the old fabric. The old fabric was considered as aged, as unhealthy, as an embarrassment. So one should take out the guilt of the tabula rasa from the shoulders of the
of
architects.
the modernists.
It's really very important to see things in a broader historical perspective.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it wasn't just the European cities under industrialization, but also the colonial cities around the world, the black cities, the dark cities. These were all considered politically in mercantile capitalism and colonialism as places of unhygiene, darkness, and to be cleaned up. So, in a sense,
to be cleaned up, also because there were various types of motivations. Some were social, humanitarian, and others were simply making money out of the cities.
Yeah, I like this notion. I mean, you have argued elsewhere, and which is, I think, an important idea, which I find great sympathy with, that things aren't. Architectural agency isn't absolute in the sense that it isn't that we originate and imagine everything, or that we are simply, carrying on the backs of politics and capitalism, good or bad. It's a sort of a partial game, isn't it? That we kind of obviously have to work with the real forces of life. But we sort of insert partially, architects insert a kind of a partial agency in there, which is in part written by the circumstances of production, but has only a certain amount of individuality and autonomy, regardless of what we claim.
Here, I think there is an important concept which has been proposed by the Swiss linguist and psychologist Jean Piaget, who talks about assimilation, assimilating reality, assimilating change, adjusting yourself to the surrounding world. And I think even the most radical architects were the ones who wanted to shake completely all the existing culture, had to assimilate what was around them. Look at Le Corbusier arriving in Rio or Algiers. He could not simply implement the Voisin plan. He had to articulate his plan with the topography, with particular types of fabrics. He had to take into account and assimilate what he was dealing with. The same in Chandigarh. He had to assimilate some significant aspects of Indian civilization, and would not have done the same plan in France or in Germany.
So we're talking about modernism. And in a sense, if I may say, we are really talking about the mid-century modernist model.
I'm really very hostile to the term mid-century.
Please explain. Yeah, go ahead.
No, for me, it has become a sort of cliche, mid-century modernist, but it's a vocabulary which is used by antiquarian dealers, by people who sell furniture. I don't think it's a scholarly concept. Rather than modernism, I would use the term modernity, which has a broader cultural meaning. So modernist for me, and I know the term is used, but I'm pretty reserved, because it has a sort of stylistic component, which doesn't give a clear account of what were all the other dimensions of the project of modernity at large, as it developed in architecture and music, in art, in literature, in society at large. So we have to be careful when we use this term. And again, and mid-century is another issue. As you know, I've worked precisely on mid-century, on the middle of the century, which is World War II. And here, maybe I would support you by saying something happened at mid-20th century, when the Second World War, this is the hypothesis of my book, Architecture in Uniform, when the Second World War, in a way, determined the victory of modernity in many fields. Resistance to new ideas was completely blasted everywhere, with the exception of the Soviet bloc, and only for 10 years or so. Less than 10 years. So I'm saying that what we're dealing with, there is a core, there is a sort of short 20th century, as opposed to the long 19th century, which begins with Napoleon and ends with World War I, basically the long 19th century of the Industrial Revolution. There is a short 20th century which starts with World War I and ends in the 60s with the crisis of the discourse of modernity, the emergence of skepticism, and also the late impact of decolonization and of generational change. So there is and it's what you call mid-century modernism is this short 20th century, and it's a cycle. And you know it if you look at the career at the big creators of modern architecture. More or less, it coincides with this moment. They start before 1914 in relationship with Behrens or Bernard, with the old guys or Sullivan, the old guys who were there before, and they more or less draw their trajectory to the 60s, and then they vanish.
Right.
They all vanish. So I mean, it's a cycle of, let's say, 40 years, some 40 years.
So 40 years of the short 20th century modernity. I couldn't agree with you more that mid-century modernism is very much a capitalist furniture selling construct, if you like. But we don't need to spend too much time on that. So, but I'm interested in you continuing this. So there's this critique, late post-colonial, decolonial critiques, and other kinds of critiques from the 60s and late 60s and 70s. Some people would argue that that modernity is still an ongoing event in the 21st century. Okay, others would, where do you think, so are we still in that critique moment of the 70s, 80s playing out, or have we shifted to something else today?
As you know, Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, talked about the incomplete project of modernity. And he understood it not in a stylistic manner, not in a linguistic manner. He had in mind the process of modernization.
Yeah,
and I think he's right. The project of social, and it's particularly important to say that when we see the menace which is now hovering over Afghanistan, the menace of a major social and cultural regression these very days, as we speak in mid-August 2021. So I think the project of modernity, the creation of a culture based on creative freedom, on the subversion of the existing codes, on the search for a new convergence between science and the arts and culture. I don't think that this is obsolete. I think that we now see that the so-called postmodernism was not an overwhelming and irreversible condition, but simply a season. It was a moment of reaction in front of the what I would say the wear of a certain type of productions, in front of the aging of a generation of founders. So it was a very understandable response carried by a generation. And generations today have a different perspective, including aesthetically, returning to a series of ideas of modernity. Also, by the way, recycling postmodernism as a sort of decorative language but with a critical perspective, not in a sort of ironic perspective. So I think things have become much more complex. And here, I think one of the concepts one should apply to the unfolding of the architectural discourse as well as in other fields, and this is something I've tried to do in a little book which might be published one of these days, is the concept of generation, which is often used by sociology and history. What is a generation? A generation is defined by shared experience, by common goals, by common enemies, by an attitude. So we've seen, it will be interesting to really work at the generations which have shaped architecture since the late 19th century. I've tried to do that. The architects who were interested in the emergence of new materials and the sort of irresistible urban growth before 1914, the generation completely shaped by the destructions and the slaughter of World War I, which, for instance, made what Weimar Germany became, what the 1920s Russia became, etc. And the generation of 68 kids who were brought up in the long shadow cast by the Second World War and who wanted to have a fairly different agenda. And I think we have to we have to start looking at this layering of group age in a particular, in a more precise manner. And we'll see that every generation has a sort of, as an expectation, a horizon of expectation in respect to what the world should become, and also have a concrete experience which sometimes is contradictory with this horizon. So it might be a little abstract, but I think we have to be more flexible in using representations about the adjustment of people to time and their response. Here, I'm trying to challenge what the discourse which is called architectural history, a term I also dislike. I might be talking too much about the words, about the terms we use to describe our own work or our own discipline, if there is a discipline there. I don't think there is anything that can be called architectural history. Architectural history, for me, what I understand when I hear architectural history is a sort of history which is subservient to the architectural profession, to the expectations of the architectural world in which it is inscribed. I'm much more interested in history dealing with architecture, of history applied and using architecture as a phenomenological field for analyzing how things change. So I think we should be careful about this term, or maybe we can use it, but knowing that what its limits and its implications are.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I also try and look at architecture as a test case for talking about processes of, if you like, culture and the larger worlding of the world. But let me return to the earlier contention about generations. And certainly one can see, as you articulated in the 60s, 70s, even 80s, that there was a kind of a generational response, the era of the big figures in modernism and a sort of a kind of a big picture worldview. So therefore, we are in the next generation today, yeah? I mean, from the 90s onwards, roughly from, I don't know, let's say from the fall of Berlin Wall. Yeah, end of the Cold War, yes. So you wouldn't argue in the terms of the larger history of the world that with the global economy and now with this sort of significantly looming project of the climate crisis, that we are in a significantly different stage of life?
Absolutely. I think there are many signs that show that not only, I mean, if we look at what we can very narrowly, and this is what you demonstrate in the splendid volume you have edited with Maristella Cachato, see that our discipline is way more diverse and is able at looking in a comprehensive manner at a wide spectrum of experiences which were outside of the accepted discourse. So there is an awareness, a much wider internationalization of the, I wouldn't say globalization, but internationalization of culture, which at the same time has some aspect that can be perceived as frightening, and you have also some neo-nationalists which are rather disturbing.
Yes.
At the political level, you're of course aware of more than I am of what happens with Mr. Modi in India, for instance.
Well, Mr. Modi, Mr. Trump, Mr. so on.
Trump, Mr. Orban in Hungary, all the way. And we see how history can be really a battlefield. I mean, the policy of Putin to completely domesticate history which is taking place these days, the creation sort of neo-Stalinist discourse in Russia and the repression against dissidents in the historical discipline is extremely worrisome. So we are in a very exciting and also very threatening context today, with, I think, young scholars, young professionals who are more internationalized than ever. Look at the mobility of professionals from the last maybe 2 generations. It's not only this phenomenon can be seen at the level of a so-called most famous architects. Another term I hate is starchitects, so I won't use it, but at the level of these architects who are the, I would say, the haute couture of the profession, it has been happening not only in the last decades. It started when precisely Le Corbusier, or even before Le Corbusier, the Beaux-Arts bosses were invited to Brazil or Argentina in the early 20th century. It's an old phenomenon. What is new is that it's much more modest, I would say, or younger professionals are engaged in a sort of very mobile system today. And architects coming from regions which we now call in American universities the global South are invited to work in the North. And I think that this is really important phenomenon which had never existed. Probably it started only around 1939 when Oscar Niemeyer was invited to build the Brazilian pavilion at the New York Fair. Probably the first time an architect from a previously colonized nation, knowing also that the US had been previously colonized, but an architect from a previously colonized nation was making a big statement in the North. So it's at the scale of human history, it's like yesterday. But today, I think this international condition, this transnational condition, the existence of offices which are operating in many places, and not only, again, the top 20 is something really, really different. The idea that architectural expertise can be shared widely is an interesting one. Combined also with reactions, with counter movements.
So as we start moving towards the end here, how would you distinguish this kind of, let's say, internationalization with the kind of something of a, let's say, decolonial component from ideas of the genericity? This kind of proliferation of a kind of I don't know, you call it negatively cut-based architecture or positively transferent aspirational architectures and cities?
Well, I don't know. Again, this has to do with I would return to Karl Marx and the idea that sacred values are all the virtues and great ideas are drowned. His term has drowned in the icy waters of profit-oriented egoism, of capitalism. I would say that the norms of spatial transformation have been defined by market-oriented capitalism almost everywhere. This is the way previously so-called socialist countries have transformed. This is the way previous colonized countries have been transformed. The only exceptions, in a way, are either countries which remain still outside of the world markets, or countries in which you have an extremely strong preservation establishment and very, very solid planning culture. But even there, I'm taking the case of Holland, where I spend a lot of time. The same is true everywhere. So we're facing an irresistible thrust of capitalism and the market, and in which some islands of specificity can sometimes be kept for, of course, in relationship with tourism and leisure.
Of course, yeah.
Also, when identity and historicity becomes profitable, it is maintained. And in very few cases, when you have a local alliance between well-intentioned rulers and distinguished professionals and designers. So I think we are living in this world where which is different from the previous world, because again, I would, as you know, the Marxists insisted very much on the contradiction between town and country. This was, by the way, more Engels than Marx. But it was one of the signs of capitalism. But today, the sign of capitalism is probably the disappearance of a country, which is becoming a worldwide suburbia. Even if agriculture continue to operate and if there is a sudden return to agriculture. So this basic difference, which was in a way the prophecy of the third landscape, which had been made by Ebenezer Howard between town and country, has taken an unexpected form, in which the idea of Howard and others, the progressive ideas, have been completely instrumentalized in the best cases, or forgotten in the worst.
Right. What do you say about the sense of crisis? You know, I mean, particularly with the climate and all these rise of neo-nationalisms today. Would you say, well, we've been through this many times before? Certainly there was a strong sense of crisis in the late 19th century, major crises in the 20th century. And, you know, this is the condition of modernity, one of its parameters. Or do you think there is something specific about our newest thinking about this?
Well, it's clear that we're facing a crisis which has no precedent. We're of course, the destruction of the countryside by industry started in England or France, in the developed countries of Europe in the 19th century. But this was at a completely different scale. The scale of destruction of natural landscape, the scale of destruction of cultural landscape, which was disappearing, the threat in terms of brutal change of living conditions is unprecedented. And again, it's not a matter that design, the forces of good design, can have a role, can point to some partial solutions, can deal with the rising water levels with creative techniques, can deal with the rise of temperatures also with other types of buildings, can devise low energy solutions, but they clearly can't stop the movement by themselves. So what we need is, in a way, at a totally new scale, to recreate the alliance which made the best projects of modernity possible, which were alliances between political rulers and designers. I have in mind the municipality of Frankfurt and Ernst May in the 1920s. I have in mind Nehru and Le Corbusier in Chandigarh. I have in mind the municipality of Barcelona and the new generations of architects in Spain and Europe in the 1980s and 90s. What happened also in Berlin at the time of the IBA and sometimes more recently. So I think we need a new scale of interaction and of joint reflection and collaboration between political forces and cultural forces. Otherwise, the cultural forces will make very brilliant, very subversive, very promising statements, which will remain very small islands in an ocean of horror.
Well, Jean, with that hope and fear, with the idea of we have to have another big discussion on patrons and architects, which I know is a topic you work extensively on also, but which I have also great interest in, and what makes for a good patronage and what are good collaborations with political and other kinds of leaders and designer architectural agencies is a great topic. But we leave that for the next conversation. But I thank you for recording this with me and for sharing your thoughts on the long 200 years. We started in the late 18th century with your ancestors moving from Morocco to Paris, and we have ended with our contemporary times. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis.
My pleasure, Vikram. I'm very happy to have shared these perhaps too vague thoughts with you. And see you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.